Today's podcast, it's pretty straightforward. We are going to share, I'm going to share with you a book that I read last month that was super impactful. A book that really packed a punch in terms of meaning, a book that really struck me to my daggone core. That book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Man's Search for Meaning. Incredible book. Just a brief kind of synopsis. In 1942, Viktor Frankl, along with his wife, mother, brother, and friends, were deported to concentration camps of World War II. The book, Man's Search for Meaning, is an autobiography, meaning that the writer deals with their own experience. Frankl, a practicing doctor and psychiatrist, provides relevant psychological insights through his firsthand experience of life within a concentration camp. He finds the meaning to our finite existence and answers the deep question, what is the meaning of life? What is it? So the book, it's a hard book to read. It's hard in the sense that it makes you just feel so soft. Frankl's perspective is he is experiencing the most horrific form of human existence, to be within a concentration camp where life has been diminished to such an abnormally low point. The value of a human life is just diminished so greatly in a concentration camp. Hard to even really imagine it. I remember when I was reading the book, I was thinking, how is this nonfiction? How is this a real life account of something that truly happened? How could humans really do this to other humans, to ourselves? Why? How can something like this happen? It just raises so many questions. And Frankl's perspective, it's not so much a report on what happened in terms of the Holocaust, in terms of an exterior perspective on it. He's writing it from within the concentration camp. He's writing it from a psychological perspective of how does a person's mind change by being immersed in this horrific scenario of death, of starvation, of forced labor, of torture, of complete, utter oppression, of straight evil, malevolence. It's evil what happened in World War II with all the death. It's really jacked up. So anyways, this book, it's not like it's just a really tough book to digest. It's hard to really wrap your mind around it. And it's pretty perception shattering in the fact that it's going to cast your life in a pretty soft light. And you're going to realize, oh, I have a lot to be grateful for. Oh, I'm a free individual and I can experience joy, happiness, peace. I have excess of food. I have excess of entertainment. I have excess of ability. I have so much excess. And it just casts light in a whole life in a whole new light. And it really affected me. And so I wanted to at least put this out there and share this because I think this book is really worth reading. One, I think it's incredibly useful to realize how dark things can get, to realize how wayward humans can get. And I think it's important to be exposed to that darkness so that we're careful and that we just understand the spectrum of the way things can go for better or worse. So Frankl gives an account of his experience in the concentration camps. He goes from what it was like leading up to being in prison to actually being in the concentration camp. And then he goes into what it's like after he was liberated, released, essentially. So in the beginning, he talks about just the sheer shock of what was occurring, of what was unfolding. He recounts getting off the train to the concentration camp and them lining him men and women up into separate lines, and them all just walking up to a guard or set of guards and then pointing in different directions on where people would be placed. And that was their initial vetting of who would go on to survive and who would die right then and there. And they were looking for signs of health, who was fit for labor. So anybody that looked weak or subpar, they were immediately sent to the left. They were given a bar of soap and sent into a building that had bath written on the top, and they were gassed to death immediately. And they perished instantly. And so Frankl found out about this obviously after the fact, but just that was his initial shock of learning that news that night, that the people that went to the other side, they were sent to death. And so, the initial shock of his first day in the camp, where they stripped them of all their possessions, stripped them of their clothes, they stripped them of the hair on their bodies, they just shaved them. They lost their identity. They were given numbers. They lost all of their personal possessions. And he just talks about the recounting other people asking if they could please keep their wedding ring, if they could keep the diary, the journal they've kept their whole life, if they could keep like these things that they were so a part of who they were, and that just the people had no idea that everything would be taken from them. They had no concept of how stripped they would be of everything that is human about them. And just the slow kind of unraveling of realizing what was happening. He talks about the shock. I mean, just the absolute shock of that. It's really inconceivable to understand why. Why is this how or why is this happening? Dark times. Hard to really even want to imagine why this could happen and come face to face with it. But man's search for meaning, you're going to get face to face with it pretty much. And I think it's, as I've said, I think it's important that this information's known and this experience and perspective is known. So anyways, the book, despite how dark this might sound here now about death camps, the Holocaust, starvation, like these might be really intense concepts. But the book is actually a very encouraging, inspiring, and uplifting book to read. And that's because Frankl's perspective as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, his conclusion is that despite his psychological experience and his true being within this horrific stimuli, he realizes that humans are resilient, that humans are capable of finding meaning in their suffering, that suffering is a window unto meaning, and that is somewhat of a silver lining, and that even in the worst case of tragedy, the individual is capable of nobly shouldering the burden of that suffering, and that individual is capable of becoming worthy of the suffering. So he's kind of getting to that throughout the book. And so it's a lot of emotion to read this book, but it is uplifting. It is a story of inspiration. And there's several really amazing insights that Viktor Frankl comes to throughout the book. A couple of them here. So as far as the question, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of life? That's like asking, it's like asking a chess player what's the best move in the game. It's dependent and it changes often. It just can't be answered simply. It's a lot more complex than that. So, some takeaways from the book. Man should not ask what the meaning of his life is. Rather, he must recognize that it is he who is asked. Life questions man. Man does not question life. Life asks, what can you do for me? Man must answer for his own life. He can only respond by being responsible. Viktor Frankl says, responsibility is the essence of human existence. And the fact he came to that conclusion through his suffering, I suppose it just rings true. Responsibility is the essence of human existence. So one can find meaning if you're surrounded by death and surrounded by evil. One can find meaning in sustaining the will to live. Viktor Frankl's assertion is that will to meaning is the greatest motivation for humans, and it overrides the will to pleasure and the will to power. So will to meaning is greater than will to pleasure and will to power. Will to meaning. And there's something about voluntarily shouldering immense pain, of finding value and worth as a soul in extreme suffering. I guess it's odd that suffering can bring about the deepest form of meaning. There's something really interesting about that. Genuine human achievement is still possible in the worst conceivable existence of well-being. Human achievement still possible in the worst existence of well-being. That's high praise for the human spirit, right? That is very high praise for the human soul, the human, I guess, individual sovereignty, that it does surpass immense oppression, that individual sovereignty that you can literally die and be worthy of dying. Like death, you can be worthy of just complete defeat. There's very deep spiritual implications behind these concepts. Another interesting fact about Frankl is he coined or initiated or started what's called logotherapy. In this book, Man's Search for Meaning, he talks a lot about logotherapy and this form of practice that Frankl somewhat originated. Logotherapy, what is it? Logotherapy is like psychoanalysis, but different. It's less retrospective and it's less introspective because it focuses on future aims, goals, and reasons to live. So traditional therapy might be going into the past to relive an experience, to reprocess it. It might be going inward and looking at yourself and who you are in your past. Going inward is like going into the past. But Frankl's strategy is that the will to meaning, it's going to be found in sustaining, which is found in looking at a future aim and a future goal. So it's not retrospective, it's not introspective, it's forward thinking. So logotherapy, it's built on the will to meaning. As I said, its primary motivation is a will to find meaning over a will to pleasure or a will to power. And I want to assume that his conclusion is because of his experience in the camp, because in the camp there was no will to power and there was no will to pleasure. As a prisoner, you're starving, you're forced labor, you're suffering daily, your friends are dying, everything you understand about human life is diminished. You're treated as an animal. You are not a human. It's inhumane to the utmost extreme. And there's no will to power within that structure, and there's no will to pleasure within that structure. So you might as well just die. But Frankl's silver lining is, I don't know if it's a silver lining, but his whole cornerstone about his form of therapy as a psychoanalysis is will to meaning is actually the deepest form of motivation. And it's so deep that you can even persevere through that extreme and not die and continue to live. So will to meaning is a very high point of emphasis in Frankl's practice as a psychiatrist, which is pretty interesting to learn. Tragic optimism. Suffering is a form of achievement. Guilt is an opportunity to change. Death is an incentive to take responsibility and act. So the book's just incredible. It all in all, um, I mean, it's covering the most important question: what's the meaning of life? It definitely hits on that. And gosh, I'm just grateful for this book. I'm grateful that I'm able to read it. I'm grateful that I came across it when I was in the bookstore, and I highly recommend it to my friends and family or anyone watching this video. Um, it is as I've mentioned, a difficult book, but it's certainly worth understanding, and it offers a lot of for hope and perspective on, you know, our individual current situations, where we're at right now, how I'm feeling right now. I remember reading the book and it casting my life in a new perspective. And there's something extremely deep and empowering about it and human about it. And it's incredibly sad. It's really hard to read because Frankl's spirit is just so, I mean, it comes through in the book, the way he writes, his account of things, the anecdotes from his overall time with other humans within the concentration camp, this extremely abnormal psychological experience of being imprisoned and just everything that comes with it. It's an amazing book. So I really wanted to get that out into the world, I suppose, and grateful that I'm able to share these insights with you. And thank you guys for watching. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you on the next podcast.